Well, welcome everybody. Good to see you all here. I'm Dave Ferguson, Dean of the College. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first guest lecture of the year. We've got a good lineup this fall, so we've got 4 more lectures coming up. The next one is on September 29th, and that'll be Daniel Glenn. For the professionals in the room, we do have continuing ed credits. The LACES and AIA sign-up sheet is outside. And also, I just wanted to say the spring lineup for guest lecturers is not fully locked in yet. So if any of you have ideas or you've seen a good speaker or there's somebody you've always wanted to hear, please stop in the dean's office and let one of us know, and we'll kind of work on that, see if we can pull it off. So without further ado, to do the introduction of our guest lecturer tonight, I'm going to introduce Natalie Yates from the Department of Landscape Architecture.
Good evening, everyone. Everybody hear me? All right. I am so excited to see Joe's lecture tonight. Joe is a principal at STIMSON Studio and has been practicing landscape architecture for 25 years. His body of work consistently focuses on a rigorous commitment to exceptional craft and detailing, performative landscapes, and a holistic team approach to the design process. His projects have been recognized for national and regional awards, including the American Society of Landscape Architects 2019 Award of Excellence for the Heritage Museum and Gardens' Flume Fountain. Joe believes in the vital collaboration between client, designer, contractor, manufacturer, artisan, and caretaker. His gratitude for collaborator contributions stems from his childhood experience on the grounds crew of his father's golf course, which instilled an appreciation for the contributions of many toward a common pursuit. His experiences inspired a deep relationship with the environment and the primary materials of landscape: soil, water, and plants. He followed in his father's path, pursuing a Bachelor of Science in Horticulture from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and interned with leading superintendents and researchers in Illinois, Ohio, and California. He was awarded the Faculty Scholarship. He received a Master in Landscape Architecture from The Ohio State University and was awarded the American Society of Landscape Architecture's Merit of Excellence in the Study of Landscape Architecture, the Walter L. Chambers 29 Scholarship in Landscape Architecture, and was inducted into Phi Alpha C Honorary Horticulture Society. Joe has lectured at the Parrish Art Museum, the American Society of Landscape Architects, the Boston Society of Landscape Architects, Envision Resilience, and the American Society of Consulting Arborists, and served on the Boston Society of Landscape Architects' Executive Committee. Joe lives on and manages a 12-acre experimental homestead alongside his wife, a landscape architect, their family, and a tenant farmer. He and his family are committed to a lifetime of land preservation and environmental stewardship. Please join me in welcoming Joe. Excuse me. Joe Wahler from STIMSON Studio.
Thank you. I'll use this one.
Hang on. Can everybody hear me all right? Great. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for the introduction. I'm excited to be here. I just passed 20 years at STIMSON as a landscape architect. So I use this opportunity for this presentation to kind of reflect back a little selfishly on all the things that I've been involved in, that STIMSON has been involved in. And my hope today is to kind of give you a sense of what it's like to practice at STIMSON, the way that we approach our practice, and as Natalie said in the introduction, the vital collaborations. None of us do this on our own. We don't sit there and dream up an amazing thing and get it created. It takes many people in order to realize the projects that STIMSON has had the opportunity to be involved in. So hopefully I can convey that. I was doing a little data as I prepared for this. In the time that I started with STIMSON in 2005 to today, we've had 800 new project starts. And so that's an incredible amount of projects. And we've got an incredible range of projects, from small private gardens, less than 1,000 square feet, up to 100-acre public parks and everything in between. So today, I'm going to try to share 25 projects. It's kind of chronological, so you can kind of see what I was doing and what my teams and I were doing together, and the collaborators that I was working with throughout that process. So that's what I mean by a way of practice. STIMSON's foundations are in Steve Stimson, the founder of our firm, and Charbrook Farm in central Massachusetts in a town called Princeton, Massachusetts. Steve is a 10th generation member of this family. They had dairy cows, they hayed the fields. He and his brothers, about 15 years ago, started to think about what could we do with this land that would support the practice and remain or keep the land productive. And so they started a tree and shrub production garden. Here on the bottom right, you see members of our studio. And although this is a commercial retail enterprise, we are trying to sell these trees. We're using them on our projects. It is more importantly an opportunity for our staff and team to get the practical experience with, as I said in my bio, our primary material as landscape architects is the plant material that we get to work with. We share, other aspects with structural engineers, architects, civil engineers, but plants are the one thing that landscape architects truly control. And so this is a foundational aspect of the STIMSON way of practicing, is really understanding the materials that we work with. We're a team of about 40 people. We're primarily in 2 studio locations, one in Princeton that you see here in the bottom right. This is Matt and Eddie in Buckwheat working on a charrette. And we're also based in Cambridge in Inman Square, which is between Harvard and MIT. And that studio gives us access to a lot of the architects that we collaborate with, the engineers and the institutions that we work with. We talk a lot about our way of practice, this kind of respect for people's personal life and the balance between work and life, and what we call slowness, this kind of craft-based understanding. I've talked with some of you today about it, this process of understanding our materials, of drawing and then drafting, modeling, and coming back to. And so, on the bottom left, you see a project I'll talk about, the Coonamessett River. Here, David and Saloni are working on a model studying the framing of this really unique overlook for a cranberry bog renovation. And then the upper image is us at Haystack Center for the Arts in Maine. And we had a 1-week retreat here where the office was shut down, and each of us had the opportunity to do metalworks, pottery, woodworking, painting, and we kind of immersed ourselves in this aspect of making. And I think that's what is quite unique about STIMSON, is we're really interested in making, we're interested in the history of materials, how materials have been used, how they can be readapted and interpreted for our time. And so hopefully you'll see that through the projects that I'm going to share today. These are just some images. As I alluded to, the studio work does not stop in our studio. The connection with our contractors and our partners in the field is critical. Upper left-hand image, we're working with Groundwork Lawrence on the planting of a pollinator garden, working with contractors to figure out the relationship of materials, unforeseen conditions, gaining the knowledge and expertise of our partners in the field. And then I've talked with some of you today, really understanding the scale of what we're making. It's easy in the computer or even in a hand sketch to lie to yourself about the scale of something. So getting in the field and really feeling how it's going to impact that space. This is Mary Suhu Park on the Greenway in Boston, the first Greenway park built as part of the tunnel project. So I was attracted to STIMSON by 10 Landscapes, and many of you might not know about this book, but it was the first book published on Steve's work from the early 90s through I think about 2000. And I had started at Sasaki and had a mentor, Carol Moyles, whose husband had known Steve through practice in school. And as I was working with her, she mentioned Steve, she talked about Steve, so I kind of started to follow what he was doing. And at the time, he was based on the Cape and primarily focused on private coastal residences. This is a project in Chilmark, Massachusetts on Martha's Vineyard. And what drew me to the work was this kind of vernacular approach to materiality. There's a timelessness about this, and there's also a tension between this very controlled landscape and this wilder landscape beyond, and that really appealed to me. The other thing I didn't quite understand at the time were the detailing and the objects. I thought, Steve is this master, he can make and dream up anything. But what I've come to understand is that he is a master, he's amazing, but it's also these partnerships and the collaborative process between artists and metal makers. Here, the stone artist on Martha's Vineyard made these two sculptures in the two corners, left and right, kind of reflecting the topography that you see there beyond the bay in Martha's Vineyard. These kind of embedded details within the landscape add greater meaning and depth to the work. And this is another example of that from the same project, working with Sebastian Richard, who's a French-trained master metalsmith here, just working on the details of these connections between stone and wood, the bronze, these hand-forged connections. All of this craft is what really drew me to the practice, and I think what remains a kind of key aspect of our work. When I started, we were based only in Falmouth. We were in an old general store in downtown Falmouth, and we all lived in our kind of small cubicles, and we called it silos. Everybody had their project that they were working on with Steve, and you were in charge of that project, and there was sometimes a little bit of cross-pollination, but we really kind of lived in our own worlds. And I'll show you some photos of our studio over time, but I think one thing that hopefully I'll be able to convey is the kind of evolution of how we've practiced and broken down those silos and are much more collaborative. So I started in 2005, and when you start in a firm, you kind of come in and you pitch in anywhere that you can help, right? You're trying to learn the ropes, you're trying to figure out what the mission is of a place, how the work is done, where the files are saved, down to the minutiae, right? So I came onto this project for Buckingham Brown and Nickel, a private school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with Centerbrook Architects, and I talked a little bit about this earlier. This building was beautifully designed, all this copper flashing, but towards the end of construction, all of the contingency for the project had been used up, and the landscape budget was gone. And so we're 90% through construction. We have bid documents. The client says we need to figure out how to make this landscape for half the cost now. So this was a really good learning experience for me. Instead of the typical value engineering process where you start to slice things out of the project and try to just pull anything together, we had this kind of epiphany. We said we've got to stop and go all the way back and rethink. And so this is, I think, representative of our iterative process in the process of re-examining, reconsidering, and coming up with a new solution. So what we ended up doing here is we rethought this space, and then instead of using some of the more refined materials, we started to think about what are the most efficient and salvaged materials and eat up the most square footage. So instead of stone planks through here, we started to think about these are old road plates. When you see road construction, they cover up the big vault. So these plates are 4 by 8 feet, ½ inch thick, that span through this garden. We used it for a chess table, and we really, just kind of rethought how we could make a meaningful landscape within this space, which was a really pivotal learning experience. This landscape was all based on the Charles River and the oxbow formations, when a river kind of bends back on itself and separates and detaches it. So we were really playing this is right along the Charles River with this idea that this courtyard is an oxbow and the flow of that, pulling off that landscape of the river. At the same time that I'm picking up that project in the end of DD, early CD, one of the first projects I started was a private residence on oyster harbors on Cape Cod with Catalano Architects, Sullivan Engineers. This was a really interesting project right on West Bay. The house previously sat right up on the coastal bank, and in Massachusetts, we have requirements for coastal resource setbacks, 100 feet, and we were able to convince this client to move back and really make this articulated landscape. And then you see that repetition of that tension between this very controlled landscape and this preserved wild landscape. You could imagine a lot of clients with coastal landscapes would not want any trees there, would want to have a full view, but these clients really appreciated the quality that came from preserving those trees. So we're working on this private residence of about 2 acres. At the same time, we are brought on by Danish Arkitekten, who had won a competition for Harvard's new science complex in the Alston neighborhood on the west side of the Charles River. Danish Arkitekten is based in Germany, one of the most progressive, sustainable architects in the world. We had had a good connection with Harvard from other projects. We were recommended to Danish by the university, and they brought us on. This is our first view. So this project was going to be 4 buildings. Some of you might know this project, but I'm going to segment this project into 2 pieces, because there was the 2006 to 2008 project where we had developed full concepts, full construction documents, but then the Great Recession came and the project went on hold. They built a 5-acre below-grade basement that was empty. They kept construction going for multiple years to keep their building permits open, but the project was never built beyond that basement. But some of the conceptual ideas of that initial project from 2006 held, and I'll show later in our 2014 project, this idea of what is unique about Harvard. And I talked a little bit with some people about this today, how we go through this digging process and trying to peel back the layers of the onion to figure out what is unique about a project and what, connects it to its place. So here, thinking about the yard, the iconic yard of Harvard with the plainer lawns and the desire routes crisscrossing, and then the kind of flow of the Charles River, and those 2 systems overlaid on one another. Worked with Danish and niche engineering, Dan User water architecture to come up with a system of stormwater capture, collection, and celebration. Here is a water feature that was going to flow through these wetlands. And then we developed a diagram with Danish and the engineers of how that water could be collected from high roofs, from low roofs, directed through the landscape, stored in below-grade basement, and then reused for irrigation and building functions. But as I mentioned, in 2008, the Great Recession hit. Harvard probably had the resources to build it, but decided it was better to hold at the moment. And instead of developing that landscape, we developed a perimeter buffer landscape with Danish that basically sealed off the landscape and designed these walls. And so we had developed 100% construction documents, and this is what we had. We had no idea that this project would ever come back. So, at the same time, we're kind of shelving that project. And just jumping scale again, this is a project in Newport, Rhode Island, another residence. A previous developer had blasted and destroyed this site and just left it a mess. Our client saw the opportunity, obviously, with a great view overlooking Rhode Island Sound. We worked with Kistler and Knapp builders, Michelle Foster here, architect who's working through the center, to kind of think about how could we use this destroyed site to the benefit of our new development. We started to process all of that blasted bedrock on site, and that started to be used as fill and sub-bases for the materials. Then on the Harvard project, we were working with Pine and Swallow soil scientists, and we brought them in to help us develop a whole new soil profile for this site. And then this is the resultant project. Our back is to Rhode Island Sound, but you can kind of make the correlation between that lunar landscape and this. So I think there's these kind of transitions that are happening on projects and these overlaps. At the same time, in 2006, we got an opportunity to work with the Parks and People Foundation in Baltimore, Maryland. This is an incredible non-for-profit organization in the city, working on connecting people with green space and the healthy benefits of being connected to green space. They had acquired the old superintendent's house for Druid Hill Park, which is an Olmsted Brothers landscape. This was the superintendent's house and kind of the headquarters for the management of the park. It's next to a really important mass transit connection point, really in an underserved part of Baltimore. In this project, we thought about how could we resurrect and preserve this historic structure and reinvigorate this town with Zigger Sneed and with the Parks and People Foundation building on their mission. Unfortunately, this property had been abandoned for about 30 years, and every undesirable invasive species had overgrown some really beautiful heritage trees. So in working with Parks and People and their connections, we had a herd of goats on this property for a month, which did incredible work removing everything from about 10 feet down, all the poison ivy, all the things that nobody else wanted to touch. And through doing this, we were able to identify which of the heritage trees were worth preserving. Zigger Sneed did a beautiful job converting the old superintendent's house into a new meeting house, and we developed a landscape with Parks and People that transitioned from the lawn and tree landscape of Druid Hill Park to this more naturalistic, pollinator-friendly landscape. While that project's going on, we're also up on Prince Edward Island in Canada, in the Atlantics, trying to make a landscape for a client who had moved to California but grew up on Prince Edward Island. If you've been to Prince Edward Island, the joke there is that summer was a Tuesday last year. That's how short the season is here. Nothing grows. Black fly season is a real situation. There's not much of a landscape industry up there. It's a pretty simple place of life. And here, John Swallow from Pond and Swallow Landscapes, who had started a relationship with Harvard, who helped us in Newport, and is now here up on Prince Edward Island visiting mushroom plants with me, municipal compost factories, analyzing every opportunity to make viable soils to put back on this property, and working with our landscape contractor. This is the owner of Red Oak Landscaping with his personal tractor, trying to figure out how can we blend these components, because there's no real sophisticated soil industry there. And we were able to carefully insert this quite large residence into this landscape through those collaborative efforts of Red Oak and Pine and Swallow. On the opposite end of North America, we're down in San Antonio, Texas. This is actually, should say 2008. We are invited to the competition for Hardburger Park, and we're fortunate to win this. I wasn't an integral member of this team, but I was helping on the renderings. I literally put that park on the truck that's flying underneath the bridge. I think I put this deer in this rendering. This is all Photoshop collage. There's no modeling in this drawing. This is kind of before the rhino world. We're just kind of making up these views to show this idea. This is a 300-acre park that spans a highway through the center. So our concept, again, kind of digging into the history. This was a cattle farm that had been heavily grazed. A lot of the diversity of the landscape had been lost. A lot of the habitat had been lost. And we also looked at the kind of natural forms of the mission landscapes in the area, and came up with this idea of these kind of rooms, these outdoor rooms, interconnected with trails and sight loops and sight lines and field stations throughout the project. Here's a competition-winning entry, again a Photoshop rendering showing that land bridge, which will receive an award. I can't figure out how to point here. Here we go. This land bridge was just completed in 2022, and we just received an ASLA award, which we'll receive in October for that. But previously to that, we had these kind of two halves of the park, and finally that land bridge is spanning those together. So I'm going to dive a little deeper into the Flume Fountain. This project I started with Steve in 2008. This is for Heritage Museums and Gardens. This is in Sandwich, Massachusetts, where my family lives. This project was about a half mile from our house. This project coincidentally coincided with the birth of our first child, so you'll see some photos of him in here throughout it. But the Lilly family from the Eli Lilly pharmaceutical company, their heirs developed this land in the late 20th century, late 1960s. They had taken it over from a gentleman named Dexter, who was a great horticulturalist and had propagated and selected a lot of rhododendrons. So there's this great distribution of amazing number of different rhododendron collections. But the Lilly family was interested in showing American history, American culture, and so they started to develop. Here in the center, you see a replica of the Hancock Shaker round barn. They had built a replica of a Temple of Virtue, which I don't think shows up on this plan, but might show up on a later plan. Steve had been working with them on a couple of projects. Here, the Temple of Virtue, a replica of a Revolutionary War building. Steve was asked to do a installation that would celebrate the rhododendron bloom. In typical Steve fashion, he came up with this very modernist approach, and this grid of rhododendrons placed in glass votives, which were sunk into the ground and marched meticulously across this planar lawn. We are also asked to develop a maze garden for them. Here on the left, you see the axonometric drawing of that, and here we demonstrated a number of native and non-native vines and ground covers for heritage. But then in 2008, we were asked to make a entry feature, and this was their entry building at the time. Since then, this building's been replaced and actually repositioned to really highlight the Flume Fountain. But this is an interesting place because your arrival at this point was a little underwhelming, and the property has a lot of topography. The Flume ends up being placed, out into this landscape, and here you're starting to come to the old ticket booth. And here's our son, Jack, as an infant on a site visit. This was a project that had a very limited budget. I think we had a fee of $50,000, which might sound like a lot, but can go in a second. And so, and we had a construction budget of $350,000 to build this landscape, which is really interesting because we work on a project of a range of costs, and this is one that's gotten the most recognition and probably has one of the smallest budgets. But the concept as we've articulated it through the award submission was quite simple, and I have some of our earlier sketches, was this piercing line that holds level through this forested dell, and it has this kind of dual experience from the upper level here where the circle is on the left-hand side of this plan. You look down this line of water, and from the downhill side, as you saw where Jack was in his stroller, you've got this 26-foot drop. And so you get this quite dramatic experience. But this is the slide kind of referencing the collaboration. There's Jack with our longtime photographer, Chuck Mayer, who's captured so much of our work. And I think a lot of what you know about our work is due to Chuck, right? And not many of us get to see the amazing landscapes that are created by practitioners. But through Chuck's eyes, our work really comes to light. And then here was the lead of the project, Joan and her husband on the ribbon cutting. Here is Dan User. This is how dedicated Dan User is. And I don't know if you guys know him, but he was the fountain mind behind the World Trade Center. He's done some of the most impactful fountains, but he slid out 206 feet on this runnel to perfectly adjust the fall at the end. It's quite dedication. So these are some of the iterations, and we were talking earlier, sometimes you have to draw what's wrong before you understand what the right solution was. So early on in our process here, we're trying to test, how does this fountain start? It needs to have something more dramatic. It needs to have, kind of a precursor to this long line. So we're studying, can there be fountains that start to weave in front of that visitor building, Is it, wiggling or zigzagging? Is it more serpentine? Are there fountains coming off some bench? What is the big picture? And through that process, there's many iterations between here. We came back to what our first sketch was, which is was what the intent was, which was just this perfect line sliding out through the landscape and terminating at that view. But through that process, we hedged against ourselves. We tested other ideas. Should it be a landscape that you wander down through and kind of meander through these breaks and it feels more like a runnel that works down the hillside? Or is it really this superstructure that projects out? And the two were radically different. We were really worried that Heritage would be scared by this idea of this 200-foot-long steel structure of water versus, so that's where we're saying we're hedging. But then we started to ground this initial idea, which literally was just a sketch of this should be aligned to some historical elements. Here the sluiceways for flumes for mills found throughout New England, and that started to ground the work. We started to work on iterations of how that fountain could be detailed, the materiality, the construction. Structurally, we went back and started to think about, is that precursor right? Do we need something more there? So these are more studies. This is a study looking at, does it need a stone wall that kind of brackets the end of it? These are some of the presentations that we made to the client showing, these two options, the meandering option versus the runnel option. And here we had thought of it as this elevated body of water that set about 2.5 feet above the pavement of that surface and piercing out through that landscape. And some of these were SketchUp renderings with Photoshop. And then this is ultimately what got built. And at this point, I want to talk about the contributions of our metal fabricator core metals, because trying to build something of this scale, weight, and precision while not disturbing a forested dell is really challenging, right? And so we started to study the material, the form, the structure, started to work with Dan User to think about how can we get this water effect that we want of still water, but a waterfall at the end. So this is a sketch while I'm on the phone with Dan and we're riffing about how can we do this? How could we make still water and also get that waterfall effect, and his idea of a pan within a pan in really simplifying the structure. So here conceptually, you've got an inner pan of about 1 inch of water that spills out into an outer pan, and that outer pan is what overflows at the end. And then we just had to figure out, well, how do you distribute water along that thing, and how do you make this thing structurally sound? So we go back to the drawing board and start to model different iterations of, what is the scale of that shallow pan, the relationship to the outer pan, how are we going to distribute water, starting to test whether it's elevated or lowered, working through shop drawings with Cape Cod Fabrication to figure out, what we had specified for plumbing doesn't actually fit, working on iterations, going to the hardware store and buying the pieces and really understanding how they come together. The other challenging thing about this is that upper pan has to be plumbed from the bottom, and you've got to be able to plumb that and still maintain enough flexibility to set that pan down and be able to move it. So working with these neoprene gasket pieces, and this is what I mean by getting the pieces and really understanding, because without understanding how these pieces interact, what their sizes are, you can't detail that. We also worked with core metals to maximize our budget, thinking about material, the scale of raw material. This weathering steel comes in certain sizes. The most efficient way to use it started to inform the scale and dimensions of the material. How we detailed our structural columns, influenced by Richmond So, our structural engineer, but also by core metals. And as I described earlier, you've got this inner reflecting pool and that lower pool, which is also dead level, but water always seeks level, so that water flows out of the end Here's Cape Cod Fabrications in their shop, fabricating it, working on the diffusers, test fitting everything. Earlier sketch, but this is really the incredible part. So we, as a team could think about how to detail it, how to construct it, but how to put it up in the field. You can see here on the left, we've got manpower. We're trying to minimize machinery to preserve these amazing rhododendron. And Dan here on the right behind the rhododendron came up with this genius idea of putting these rollers on the earlier beams, and they telescoped the whole fountain out. So we started uphill and just slid that fountain all the way out. And they used the fountain as their scaffolding to kind of complete it. We used a lot of manpower to construct things, a lot of ladders. And then the kind of final product, which Chuck captured with Jack throughout the seasons. And that kind of weathering steel heals itself through a rusting process. It fits, in my opinion, beautifully into this kind of forested dell environment. And then the cascade. And this has become a key location for weddings, as you can imagine, on Cape Cod. But beyond this thing being a beautiful structure, this landscape is performing. It's capturing all the water from that hillside. We made a new water garden here. This is not only a museums, but a garden, and this was a new community, a new plant typology that they could add into their garden. And it's turned out to be a beautiful water garden and contemplative space. So as I mentioned earlier, the studio evolves. We start to tear down walls. We start to break down our silos. We're working as teams. We worked on the Volker competition. Here's Steve with the glasses, Cullen, Tom, Eddie, Chris and Jen are working on something else. I'm in the background, but I'm overhearing everything. And so I think this is a lot of the benefit of studio, hearing what each other are contemplating. At the same time, we're working with Banish on another project and for the University of Baltimore. We're getting a little bit more ambitious with our mock-ups. Here we had our caretaker build this mock-up of this water wall we had been trying to work with. We brought Dan, who we had just worked with on Heritage, in to think about how could we get interesting. We wanted this kind of leaky ledge experience, but we couldn't afford stone. We needed to do it pretty efficiently, so we started to play around with projections and recesses and running water, and discovered that recesses and exposed aggregate concrete gave us this really amazing effect. And so, working with Dan and the concrete fabricators, we choreographed these recesses and exposed aggregates, and had this nice cascade that allowed, this is right along a highway, creates this really nice white noise within that space. This is a garden in Little Compton. This was part of our missile defense station in the World War II era. Here is a fallout bunker. Just downhill off this way was where there was a missile launch spot, and our clients had bought this property and wanted to develop it. And so we started to think about, what do you do with this fallout bunker? Unfortunately, it had a lot of asbestos in it, so we didn't want to occupy the space. But working off of the information we learned from the University of Baltimore on the concrete, we started to come up with this eroded and rusticated concrete that felt like it was part of these old vent shafts from that. And it really kind of made this industrial war-like landscape up on this hill that then transitions down to this bucolic New England landscape. So in the Midwest, Forest Park. So we're going from reinterpreting a war armament to a preservation project. This is O.C. Simons, one of the founders of the American Society of Landscape Architects, had developed this park. It was set aside by Elmerian Hotchkiss in the plan. Lake Forest, Illinois, occupies the northeast corner of Illinois, and it sits right on the edge of the watershed between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. And so there's this very short distance between that mid-continental ridge to the lake. And we, through our clients, well, it started as the Garden Club, but then transitioned into a nonprofit, set out to do a preservation of this O.C. Simon landscape that also is a demonstration for the importance of our stormwater management. And these are some of our diagrams comparing, on the left-hand side, what had become of O.C. Simon's Park over time. A lot of his carriage trails had been turned into vehicular scaled roads and parking areas. His landscape had gone from a diverse, what he called urban savanna, to largely a tree and lawn landscape with a degraded bluff. And all of the stormwater was either running down the bank or put into stormwater systems. So working with an incredible team of ecologists, engineers, Cliff Miller, who's a landscape architect in Northern Illinois, as well as Craig Bergman, another landscape architect, who are our partners on this project. We started to come up with strategies to address each of these concerns while respecting Simon's original plan. So we preserved the road, but we eliminated parking and concentrated it at the edge. We added in a whole system of pedestrian paths. We went from a tree and lawn landscape to a diversified ground plane and shrubland, and all of the stormwater was daylit, and we were able to reactivate this kind of wet woodland to the south side of the property. This process of listening and learning, this is a great photo because that's Commander Lovell from Apollo 13, who lived right next door, and he was a no on this project. He wanted nothing to do with it. He didn't want his park changed. He had a memorial to his late wife in the park, but we met with him multiple times and others, and talked and iterated and strategized about what would feel appropriate, what would be an improvement to the community. So this was an important lesson for Steve and I to kind of think about, how does the community impact the process? You're not just dictating to them, you're listening and interpreting and providing what they want. So those are really valuable lessons. Some of the metrics on this project: we reduced runoff by 10 million gallons. We reduced impervious surfaces by 30%. We diversified the planting. We added over 150 trees, which are going to sequester over 15 tons of carbon. Well, they've probably already done that, and now they're working towards 75 tons of carbon in the next 20 years. So this has won environmental awards, preservation awards within the Midwest. Just some before and afters. Upper right-hand image, you see the before and then the after. Some diagrams explaining what's happening here in the landscape. Again, before and after, you can see the incredible diversity added, the management of stormwater to these inland bioswales, which protect the bluff, which is on the outside edge of that road. The reactivation of this water dependent landscape and this flat woodlands that all feeds down through the ravines and then into the lake, activating that ravine, the kind of introduction of pathways and diversity within that landscape. This is our studio in Cambridge, and here you kind of see this process of sharing, pinning up, critiquing, an important aspect of our work. As Forest Park is winding down, we're working on a small residence in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts. The architect here, David Hanlon, was a master of bending zoning. This client wanted to add an art gallery, and zoning allowed a subterranean addition up to the edge of the property. So David developed this subterranean landscape. Leo Viorelli did this beautiful light sculpture at the end that changes. This is a section through that landscape, the historic Tudor house on the left-hand side, and this kind of modern art gallery intervention with that access tower on the right. And this is another photo, Chuck Mayer's photography, Roxy Payne, Leo's work, this very restrained landscape that's just highlighting art. It's essentially making a gallery out of the landscape. Another project I want to dive into a little deeper, and I'm going to try to go super fast because I'm running late, is Ferris Foundry Park. This is a brownfield site in Lawrence, Massachusetts. We're getting closer. We're in 2021, so we're only 4 years away here from current time. But this is a really interesting former iron factory. All the spoils from that process were placed on this landscape. This was a competition by Groundwork Lawrence to put together a team. Steve and Julie Bargman were classmates at the GSD, so we had partnered with Julie on the Ford factory competition. We worked with her on the Hardburger Park competition, and she was a perfect fit for this project because we also had been working with Dr. Peter Del Tredici, who was at Harvard, who's now at MIT and perhaps retired, who had written a lot on spontaneous vegetation, the benefit of weeds, the kind of embracing of tree of heaven in these tough urban sites. And this was a learning experience for us to start to think about, when do natives make sense? When do they not make sense? And on such a degraded site like this, Peter made the argument that you should take anything that wants to grow on this site. There's literally no soil. This is part of the mill area of Lawrence and North Shore, a lot of textile work in this area. Here's Julie and Shanti forging through the landscape as we found it. Here's Brad from Groundwork Lawrence, Peter, myself kind of talking and contemplating. And this was the whole charge. Groundwork Lawrence had bought this peninsula here at the end, and the only requirement is they had to move this pile of sand from the forging process onto that parcel. And so we also, another wrinkle, we had the sewer coming through there and access requirements. So we started to think, and we visited multiple times, trying to understand, what was there, what were the remnant pieces. These are notes from Julie, starting to dig into the history of this site specifically, some of the water treatment testing that had been done there, a lot of the social issues that had happened in the late 19th century, strikes in the early 20th century, and this beautiful landscape, this really successional pioneering landscape that had rewilded it. These are some of my noodles, trying to think about how much sand do we actually have, and how do you move that much sand without disturbing things? So trying to get a handle on how much sand here, using some of my algebra to think through that. And then Julie responding with one of her beautiful sketches about, what the essence of this place was. And we didn't have a lot of information, but we knew in the 90s they stopped placing the sand there, so we used aerial photographs, satellite imagery to kind of track how this place had succeeded over 20 years. Started to sketch back and forth between dirt and STIMSON, these different iterations about how can you move that sand and occupy that sand and preserve some of that amazing urban wild that was there. A lot of iterations, a lot of discussions, developments of plans and details that celebrate water, using minimal materials here. We're in the earth moving phase, and even the best laid plans to try to not disturb more than we needed to. Obviously you end up with this crazy landscape. But in working with Peter, we took our original diagrams here, those are those satellite images, and started to imagine, how do you project those forward? Where were we able to preserve some of that wild successional landscape in certain areas? And then how do you release the rest of that landscape to kind of have that same wildness, but perhaps have more experiential qualities? Here's our team working with the community to plant that mound. Some early drone photos of it as it's just getting started. Some photos, we had a team member in-house, Knock Doan, who took a lot of photography for us and was able to go quite often. Here's some of that preserved tree of heaven, which in most landscapes you'd be scared of, but here is, killer. And just thinking about landscape throughout the year, this kind of experience of wandering up this hillside, these great views out to the Merrimack River. And this is that same photo that we saw at the beginning, looking down that same path in this, this really powerful wildness and the beauty of nature. At the same time, we're contemplating a 900 square foot garden. This is for the former director of the Brooklyn Bridge Park. Michael Van Valkenburg had recommended her to us. Steve was, I think, Michael's first or second employee. So this project was all about material and light, working with Terry Fitzpatrick in our office. They'd come up with this interesting shadow box pattern with various slats that give this really beautiful light effect. And then Harvard comes back. We didn't know if it would come back, but 2014, Banish comes back to us, and Harvard's back on. And so we go back and look at our original diagrams and our concept, but since this project went on hold, the flood elevation in Boston had been raised by 2 feet. So we had to reconsider. We had to dig deeper into what had happened in this landscape within Alston. And so we started to do these diagrams about the filling and development of this area from when it was old salt marshes to hay fields to urban infill and industrial areas. We started to look at how do these landscapes perform this beautiful painting, and starting to think about the soil layers that allow for these landscapes to hold and manage water, and the banks and how that water can be managed. We also started to think more about what is iconically Harvard, and you've got the plain of lawn, these kind of desire roots, but those desire roots start to make these fractions of lawn. And we thought that maybe there's an opportunity within those fractions to reposition those and allow for this more performative landscape to move within these fractions instead of a path system. We started to play around with topographic studies in plan, in clay, going back and iterating, modeling and exploring. We worked with Ned Friedman and the Arnold Arboretum to start to think about a plant palette. The Arboretum has made great discoveries. For instance, the metasequoia tree was thought to be extinct, and working with them that this could be an opportunity for some citizen science within this project, starting to look at details with Pine and Swallow and the engineers. This is essentially a green roof over 5 acres, and on top of it, we're proposing that it's a blue roof, that we're going to take the 100-year storm and manage it on top of an occupiable roof, move that water through the soil profile and into these cisterns. Worked with Mike Igo and Aqueous to develop an irrigation stormwater management system. Here is some data on how we were able to reduce our water use. You can see in blue in the diagram on the right where we're ponding all of these flood events and being able to manage our water, our plan. This is what a 5-acre roof looks like with tons of geofoam, and this is what that looked like in 2021 after completion. And the interesting thing about this landscape is we didn't really intend this, but Harvard didn't really have the capacity to manage a landscape like we had proposed. And so initially this horrified me, but now I'm embracing this diversity. And there's a lot of undesirables. We've got a crazy mugwort outbreak, but the kind of vitality of this landscape is just pretty incredible. At the same time, developing a pool project in Quisset, pulling on the knob, trying to push unique details, that kind of idea of the vernacular, the respect of materiality, reinventing it. This is actually the edge of a swimming pool. That water goes all the way down into the water and has this nice correlation. Working with Interfluve on cranberry bog renovations. This is a project we've been working on since 2017. This was the comprehensive plan, looking to kind of create this overlook as these bogs restore, they get a lot more tree growth. And so seeing them from the floodplain edge doesn't provide the same perspective. So this idea of taking advantage of the topography to overlook it. Betsy Gladfelter here in the middle is the engine of this project. Got crazy funding, working with the 300 committee, Friends of the Coonamessett River, some of our models. This is the restoration, Interfluve, an amazing company, employee-owned company, geomorphologists really figure out the old path of the river through mapping and also field investigations, and increase the length of the river, create safe havens for heron to be able to run back up here. Here you can see our overlook, which you'll see some pictures of here, and there's the overlook. And a lot of student groups come out here. This has led to a relationship with Interfluve to develop more boardwalks. We've started to think about, the material. This is some of the analysis of how can you construct boardwalks and what are the costs per square foot, and being able to build it in a shop versus in the field, and some work that we've done with them at Coldbrook, which is going to have sea level rise, thinking about these modular components that could be raised up over time. And these are the modular units that were able to be built off site and then placed quickly in the field, set on helical piles. Some of the experiences, another phase of Coonamessett, looking to reduce embodied carbon, create longer spans, reduce helical piles using a truss system here under construction. There's Betsy again, our fearless leader. And then working with Marston Mills, another cranberry bog restoration, thinking about different ways to build and scale boardwalks with different piers. This is a diamond pier system, which has these kind of spider legs that go out into the landscape. And currently we're working on the Bass River project, thinking about how those wood piles that Interfluve is using could become a structure for a boardwalk. We're working with Cornell currently on the Atkinson Center for Sustainability, which is coupling with some health, life science building, working with Lake Flato architects, developing this constructed wetland on the north side of this project. It'll take all the roof and site runoff, pond it, spill over into a wetland, and then release that into the river systems that run. We're in the process of working with our contractors to try to get this built. It was supposed to be completed last year. We've been working through a number of issues, reiterating, collaborating, and partnering, trying to find solutions. We've got a leaky liner right now, which is really frustrating. So we're working with our partners to try to do that. We've been able to get that front landscape along Tower Road completed, and working with them on that. Small residence restoration project, inserting a modern intervention, inviting people to Charbrook. I invite all of you guys to come to Princeton and visit us at Charbrook Nursery. This is Greg Tozzolo, our managing director, giving a tour to some Canadian students who came to visit us. Just a couple more here. Sag Harbor in Long Island. Our client owned 3 parcels at the end of this peninsula. Through research, we discovered that this land had been underwater at time. The client was willing to give up a lot of her lawn landscape. We thought about this kind of intention of restoring this native landscape and having these kind of inserted artificial elements within it. Some of our earlier sketches about connection to water and these kind of inserted jewels within that landscape, early sketch about how that might feel. Some of the completed photos here converted. This was a previously developed lot with impervious driveway and a large building. Developed this coastal meadow landscape. This is with Bates Massey Architects, Men at Work, Summerhill Landscapes, made very pervious pavement profiles from gravel and beach cobbles, diverse landscape palette. The architecture funnels all of the roof runoff through these rain gardens that pierce the center of the building. Here in the background, you see one of our jewel boxes, this kind of trellis garden that you discover on this path. This is a rendering of what that could be. Our client spends a lot of time in Central Park in the wisteria garden there. She was really enamored with. So this is early photographs of that garden in development. We repurposed a lot of the material that was on the property into these intricate patterns that are concentric rings around that center. At the same time, working with Bates Massey on another project on Long Island. This project is set right in the dune. A double lot, was all pool and asphalt, and our clients were interested in a more abstract landscape. And this landscape was all about the dimension of time and how could we place something so foreign within this landscape that it highlights the movement of sand and the migration of sand. Here's our team, Gideon and Enrico from Summerhill. This is Cecilia out in the quarry just south of Philadelphia, finding these spoil blocks of American black granite. Summerhill, delicately placing these pieces, and then how these things start to capture sand behind them. So they really become these foils that you understand the movement of sand within that landscape. Currently, we're working on Brown University's new life science building in the center of the jewelry district. Has, very little tree, a lot of flooding issues. We had this idea of, peeling back those impervious layers, cultivating that seed bank that we imagined was buried under all those layers, and then figuring out a way for people to inhabit it. Some of our early sketches. Our intern at the time, who's now a full-time employee, Emily Hayes, developed this GIF, and I'm just going to run through it quickly, that communicates what we were trying to do. We're looking at the old road pattern throughout time, how it had been developed and infilled, and then at a certain period, you start to go from that residential scale to a more industrial scale. The kind of fabric of streets get removed. You get these mega blocks and massive buildings and this kind of disconnection of the landscape. And then Brown starts to come back in and insert a new program. This opportunity of this site emerges, this idea of peeling back all of those impervious layers, incorporating this new building, cultivating that release landscape to increase, the tree canopy and impervious surfaces to reduce heat island and the stormwater buffer, and then to use the building to start to break down this mega block, and how the building circulation can start to recreate that scale in the smaller dimension and link out into the landscape. And so these were beautiful diagrams that Emily developed to help us communicate what we were trying to achieve between architecture and landscape. This is our site plan. This is us going back and forth between paper and dirty cardboard models, using Rhino to study some of these forms. We had this idea of these kind of remnant seawalls that feel like they're part of an old riverbank or seawall that can also help to create space, and using Grasshopper to model different material applications. Here we're studying the distribution of different gravel sizes, and then that some finished renderings of what that space might feel like. And the last one, I promise, just to show you the full spectrum, we're currently working in Edgartown, Massachusetts, and this is one of the most historical towns in Massachusetts, old sea captain town, brick and historic buildings. And our client is so progressive, she's willing to give up so much of her landscape to restore this native coastal landscape. So we look at maps and historic images. We analyze what's changed in these landscapes over time. Here you can see the loss of the tree layer within this landscape. We start to understand the distribution of pervious and impervious lawn and native vegetation, talking with our clients about, what can we do to make improvements here? Starting to think about how can we take their existing brick and repurpose it to make it more porous. So how do you work with that common unit to get different levels of porosity? So going between CAD to study things, and then using the brick to see how that works, trying to figure out how do those bricks support each other and how do they interlock while you're still trying to get pervious area. And we're going from a landscape on the top, which is almost 12,000 square feet of lawn, to a landscape that's got nearly 9,000 square feet of native vegetation. We're going from a landscape that's largely impervious to a landscape that's largely more pervious. And these are some of the sections where we're elevating that lawn from existing as in dash, and then excavating some of these salt marsh landscapes to kind of reconnect those into the tidal flows of the landscape. And that's it. That's all we've been working on.
Fabulous. I think we probably have, about 10, 15 minutes or so for some questions and answers, if you're willing to.
Yeah, great.
If you want to just raise your hand, and I'll come bring you a microphone so we can hear you. Who has questions?
While she's doing that, you want to say anything about your personal property?
Oh, yeah, I can. Yeah, so 3 years ago, Bernice and I bought a property in Sandwich, Massachusetts that we bought a parcel that was 7 acres. We were able to add on another parcel that's 5 acres. This is a really interesting property because the Friends Society, the Quakers, it was their first meeting house. We've got the burial ground for some of the first founders of the Friends Society just outside of our son's bedroom. Literally, you could reach out and shake hands with anybody who's hanging out there. But we've got this really amazing landscape. And what Bernice and I are trying to do was cranberry bogs. We've got about 3 acres in cranberry bogs, which we're allowing to succeed. We've converted a lot of the hillside to meadows. We've seeded about 1.5 acres of meadow. We've got a tenant farmer on the top of the hill who's growing crops and working that land. And we're, landscape architects, have our hands in the dirt trying to figure out, our plants. And I think that's one of the great things that, probably early on in your careers, you won't have the opportunity to have 12 acres, but you can have a garden plot as part of a community garden. I encourage all of you to get your hands in the dirt and start to gain some experience with those materials.
Hi,
Yeah.
Joe.
Hi.
Okay, I'm curious. So with your Harvard Alston project,
Yeah.
how much did you think that technology changes over that decade either changed the trajectory of the design or expanded the opportunities for some of those things you looked at?
Yeah, I think over that course of time, a lot changed. Like I mentioned, the flood elevation in Boston went up by 2 feet, so we had to reimagine with Danish how to make a landscape 2 feet higher than the streetscape. So that influenced a lot of things. And then we had to also think about how do you keep that potential water out of our site. So we started to think about a lot of different technologies. I think we also had gained a lot of experience. In 2006, we were looking at cistern projects, but we hadn't done that much. And over the course of that pause, we were able to build that experience and really fine tune that. Aquios and Mike Igo's team had been successful. We had implemented some on private projects. So we gained more experience. I think we also had more ambition when the project came around the second time. I think in the first project, we were being a little bit more deferential to the Harvard landscape and, kind of working the edges. But in the new landscape, we really kind of leaned into it and were able to convince Harvard that this was the right message to send to the community, that they were going to lead by example, that they were going to build this really performative. I don't know another 5-acre blue roof anywhere. So, that is just remarkable that they were willing to take that on. So.
I just had a question about the project where you maintained the big grove of Tree of Heavens.
Yep.
Maybe I missed it, but what was the purpose of maintaining those instead of replacing them? Just because, at least from where I'm from, those are invasive, are they not?
They are invasive in Massachusetts too. And this was, if you haven't read Peter Del Tredici's work, he's published a book. his whole argument is that there are sites that are so degraded that they don't have soils. A lot of our native plants don't have any chance of surviving there. And so he made an argument that although tree of heaven is invasive, that it isn't parasitic. It's not hurting anything else, and it's still sequestering carbon, it's providing habitat, and it's thriving in this really degraded landscape where we had sand, basically, not a lot of organic matter. So, I think that's where we kind of leaned into it. We did remove a lot of bittersweet and other plants that are, detrimental to others, but he made the case that these plants are doing a function, and in this landscape, they're the appropriate material or appropriate tree.
Or you mentioned working in public parks, how you had to work with the community that lived around the area. Do you have any standout examples of suggestions or anything that really influenced the process?
Yeah. It's, when you're in the public environment, sometimes the loudest voice gets the most attention. And that might not always be the majority. And so I think what we've learned through that process is to find multiple avenues for people to contribute their thoughts and feedback. And not everybody's comfortable, standing up in front of large groups or, presenting their ideas. So you've got to find different ways to hear from the full community. And I think that's what we've learned on Volker, which is now Hardberger Park, on Forest Park, on Ferris, is develop ways that you can hear from a lot of people and really understand, what the majority is after.
Else?
How often does LEED certification factor into the work you do?
Yeah, so almost every institutional project has an aspiration of a LEED target. Different universities decide whether they actually submit for that certification or just meet the criteria of it. So that's a kind of an institution by institution. I'm not going to out anybody, but Harvard kind of went above and beyond, and they're now getting Living Building Challenge certified. The Science Center has, I think, 2 of the 4 petals as certification. I forget what LEED certification. We're probably up there, but yeah. So it's a aspiration, I would say, for almost all institutional projects.
Question back here, see if it turns on.
Yeah.
You mentioned slowness, and I know you have some indication of that on the website as well. Could you speak a little bit more about how slowness relates to your process?
Yeah. So I think slowness can be explained in many ways, but in terms of the design process, it is that iterative process of giving yourself time to contemplate, to move forward and backwards, to study it in various ways. It's also the idea that sometimes you've got to let something sit for a little bit. You can't always crank on something searching. Sometimes you've got to let it sit and marinate and come back to it with a new perspective. And so in terms of practice, that's how I think of slowness. The other thing that's important in our firm is this balance between our personal lives and our professional lives. And as passionate professionals, those things always start to get blurred and interweaved a little bit. But I think finding that balance, appreciating all aspects of your life, and realizing that work is one aspect of what's contributing to what you're doing here. So.
Other questions? I had a quick one since nobody else is answering. You were talking about the nursery and how you used it to kind of grow trees in not, I guess, the rigid way and be able to sort of play with the plant materials. I was wondering, does that include also you talk about, the kind of the basic elements of landscape architecture, soil, vegetation, water, and I was wondering if that included the soil. Obviously the nursery has the soil.
That's a really great question. Yeah.
And the ferrous
that's an important thing that nurseries are typically started in bottomlands, right, where they've got heavy soils because the plants don't need as much water. But that's really challenging for a New England landscape where we're, glacial outwash, sand and gravels, those two are so incompatible that the trees from these nurseries, frequently in Maryland, lowlands, Virginia and New Jersey, those soils aren't very compatible. So we get this big disparity between what the root ball is doing and what its adjacent soil. So we have a really hard time breaking that soil. And one of the benefits of our trees at Charbrook is they're grown right in New England soils. So that compatibility between the two is and we don't do any amendments to that soil. It's just our native New England soils. Yep.
Another question over here.
Has there been a project that you've revisited like years after it's already finished and you've realized that some of the design decisions that you made then weren't being as effective, or like maybe the landscape developed and changed in a way that you weren't anticipating and made the design kind of ineffective or negatively impacted?
Yeah, we try to stay involved in our projects. We are being more specific about this post-completion process, and we have a leader within our firm, Kevin Hartzell, who has a experience in construction and restoration work, and we're really trying to get him on site. I think the thing that we're most frustrated by, like I mentioned on the Science Center, is the management of these initial annual weeds. And so that's been some of our biggest challenges, where we have these aspirations for these native landscapes. They take a little bit more sophisticated management and horticultural knowledge. And we're working to try to find a partnership with our clients that can help facilitate that. I think that's probably been one of the biggest disappointments when we go back. Good question.
All right.
I have one.
Excellent. So we don't want
I think it's important for all the students while you have their attention here.
Yeah.
So culture seems like it's very important at your studio. For as long as I've followed your studio, everything that I see on Instagram, the projects, it's all about community and culture. So what traits, characteristics, qualities are you looking for when you hire, when you get people on for internships?
Yeah.
What are those things that you're looking for to fit into this already strong culture that you have?
Team. Yeah, that's a great question. Some of the things that we're looking for and why we're here is to kind of connect with more students, a broader range of individuals. Our firm, as you've seen from the work, is very connected to technical work, right? And so one thing we're looking for are strong skill sets where people understand detailing, grading, the kind of engineering, which I've been excited to hear is an integral part of your practice. Some of the other things are passion, excitement. We can see that in your portfolios where you're willing to kind of try something new, explore something. When we meet with you, just that vivaciousness that you bring out. And then the other one, I think, is the initiative. One thing we're looking for is our young members, our new teammates, to ask a lot of questions, to bring issues to us early, right? And this is a critical part of the process of developing our projects. We don't expect anyone to know anything. I'm still learning, Steve's still learning. We're trying to learn as a team, but if we don't know that our teammates have questions or need help, and we're failing as a group. So I think initiative is a critical one. Yeah, thank you.
Well, that was a fantastic set of questions, and
yeah, thank you.
Coming from a fantastic lecture. Thank you so very much. Please help me welcome and thank Joe for his lecture.